1878. A lighthouse keeper trapped with the dead. Off the coast of Wales, the Smalls Lighthouse rose from a jagged reef of stone 20 miles from the nearest shore. Built of timber on spindly legs, it trembled with every tide and roared with every storm. In 1878, 2 men kept watch there, both ordinary keepers, bound by routine and isolation. They trimmed the lantern, wound the clockwork, recorded winds in a logbook. Their world was waves, gulls, and the endless howl of the Irish Sea. The 2 men could not have been more different. One was older, hardened by years of sea work, taciturn and strong. The other younger, quick to speak, unsettled by confinement. Weeks stretched into months and tensions grew. Silence often fell heavy between them, broken only by the clang of the lantern or the groan of the timbers beneath their feet. The lighthouse itself was fragile, a skeleton of wood rising above furious water, so each storm shook its beams, rattled the lantern glass, and made the men fear the tower would collapse. Supplies arrived only once a month. Letters came rarely, if at all. Out there, time stretched strange. Days indistinguishable, hours marked only by the striking of the bell and the swing of the light. Yet for all the hardship, duty remained. Ships depended on the glow of the Smalls. So long as the lantern burned, men in distant ports were safe. But in that spring of 1878, as waves rose higher and storms lengthened, the keeper's routine was broken, and the tragedy that followed would forever alter how lighthouses were manned. It was in the spring storms that tragedy struck. The younger keeper fell ill, whether from an infection, an injury, or some hidden weakness, no one could say. At first he worked through the pain, coughing as he trimmed the wicks, staggering as he wound the lantern's mechanism. His partner urged him to rest, but rest gave no relief. Within days, the man was bedridden, fever burning in the damp, salt-soaked air of the tower. The older keeper tended him as best he could, boiling water, wrapping him in blankets, scratching notes of his condition in the logbook. But medicine was scarce, and the sea cut them off from help. The storms raged for weeks, preventing supply boats from approaching the reef. The tower shook, waves slammed against the piles, and the sick man's breathing grew ragged. Then, in a night of howling wind, he died. The keeper was alone now, trapped with the body of his companion, with no way to signal shore, no chance of relief until the storms subsided. To cast the corpse into the sea was unthinkable. In those days, fear of suspicion ran deep. If he returned home without the body, authorities might accuse him of murder. Yet keeping the corpse inside the small, suffocating tower was unbearable. The air grew heavy, the silence more oppressive, so he made a terrible choice. He lashed the body in canvas and rope, dragging it outside to the gallery. There it lay, bound against the rail, the sea spray striking its face. And each time the storm winds rose, the corpse moved as though alive, swaying in the keeper's sight, haunting every glance. Alone with the dead, the keeper faced an ordeal no training had prepared him for. The storms did not relent. Week after week, the sea battered the fragile tower, cutting him off from every hope of relief. Supplies dwindled, the lantern required constant tending, and each night the light swept across waves as if nothing had changed. though everything had. The corpse outside became his torment. Bound against the rail, it moved with every gust, swaying as if struggling to rise. At times, the keeper imagined the dead man's arm lifting, pointing back toward him through the sheets of rain. At night, when the lantern's glow cast long shadows, he swore the face turned toward the window, watching. Sleep came only in fragments, broken by the crash of waves and the dreadful sight of his companion's remains dancing in the storm. Inside, the keeper tried to lose himself in routine. He polished brass, wound the machinery, and filled the logbook with obsessive detail. The entries grew more frantic. Notes on wind direction shifted into mutterings of guilt, fear, and despair. His handwriting became jagged, as though the pen itself trembled with him. Days blurred, hunger gnawed, solitude pressed close, and the ceaseless movement of the corpse outside began to unhinge him. He sang to himself, shouted at the gulls, and sometimes found himself speaking aloud to the dead, pleading with it to stay still. The sea gave no mercy. It raged around the tower, relentless, as if conspiring to trap him with the horror he had created. On the Smalls, the line between duty and madness grew thinner each day, until even the light itself seemed to waver. The longer the storms held, the more the keeper's mind began to fray. Each day he rose to trim the lantern and wind the gears, but the motions felt hollow, as though performed by a stranger. His world had narrowed to the creak of timbers, the crash of waves, and the ceaseless swaying of the corpse outside. At times he imagined his dead companion was still alive. He muttered conversations aloud, asking questions, pausing for replies that never came. He laughed suddenly, then shouted in rage at the silence. The gulls circling the tower became tormentors, shrieking endlessly, their cries blending with the phantom voice of the man he had lost. The body outside, lashed to the rail, seemed to mock him. The wind tugged at the canvas shroud until tatters flapped like arms, waving. When storms intensified, the head lifted and fell, as though nodding. More than once he stumbled back from the window, convinced the corpse had moved of its own will. His logbook grew darker. Once filled with neat notes of wind and tide, now it bore jagged scrawls. He looks at me. He will not be still. The sea conspires. Ink blotches stained the paper where his hand had trembled. Sleep eluded him. When he closed his eyes, he saw the shrouded figure rising against lightning, arms outstretched. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat though the tower was cold. Alone with only storms and shadows for company, he teetered at the edge of madness. The Smalls Lighthouse, built to protect sailors from the sea, had become his prison, and within that prison, his own mind was turning traitor. Despite his torment, the keeper clung to his duty. Each dusk he climbed the narrow stairs, trimmed the wicks, and set the great lens turning. Through madness, hunger, and fear, the lantern never failed. Its beam swept across the Irish Sea, a pulse of light that guided ships clear of the jagged reef. From passing vessels, sailors looked up and saw the steady glow and assumed all was well. None could imagine that inside the trembling tower, one man fought against despair, while another's corpse, lashed outside, rocked in the storm. To mariners far at sea, Smalls Lighthouse shone as a symbol of reliability. To the keeper within, it was the only thread binding him to sanity. Each night, he wound the heavy mechanism, the clank of gears echoing through the wooden frame. He polished brass with shaking hands, muttering to himself that if the light died, so too would he. The ritual became obsession, an anchor in the chaos. The lantern's glow seemed to hold back not just the sea, but the encroaching madness. Yet the light also mocked him. Every revolution of the lens illuminated the corpse outside, casting grotesque shadows across the gallery. Sometimes the beam caught the face beneath the torn shroud, making it seem alive, eyes flashing as the glass turned. The very duty that kept him sane also deepened his horror. Still the lantern burned. Night after night, through storms that seemed endless, its beams swept the horizon, steady, unbroken, a miracle wrought by a man who was unraveling. Ships passed safely, unaware that the price of their salvation was one keeper's descent into darkness. At last, after weeks of storms, the sea calmed enough for a relief boat to approach the reef. As the crew drew near, they expected to see two men waiting on the gallery, waving from the platform as keepers always did. Instead, they saw a terrible sight. A single figure pacing the deck, and beside him another, bound upright against the rail, its canvas shroud whipping in the wind. At first, the rescuers thought two keepers still lived, one standing, one bracing himself against the storm. But as they closed in, horror struck. The second was no living man but a corpse, lashed and weather-beaten, its head lolling with each gust. The survivor rushed to meet them, his eyes wild, hair matted, hands shaking uncontrollably. He muttered half-coherent words, clutching at the boatmen as if afraid they too would vanish. Inside the tower they found a scene of decay. The logbook lay scattered with frantic entries, ink blotches and jagged lines replacing neat reports. The lantern still burned, astonishingly steady, its brass gleaming as if polished daily. Yet the air reeked of mildew, sweat, in despair. The keeper was taken ashore, gaunt and hollow-eyed, his mind frayed by solitude and terror. Though alive, he seemed less a man than a shadow, his words rambling between sense and delirium. The corpse was finally lowered into the sea with prayers, a burial long delayed. What the rescuers carried back was not only a broken man, but a story that would echo across Britain. A tale of madness on the rocks, of duty upheld in the face of nightmare. The Smalls Lighthouse had held through the storm, but at a terrible cost. The survivor of the Smalls returned to land, but he was never the same. Though alive, his mind bore the scars of weeks spent in torment beside the dead. Neighbors described him as withdrawn, staring often at the horizon as if still trapped within the swaying tower. The story of his ordeal spread quickly, whispered first among seamen, then printed in newspapers across Britain. It became more than a tale of misfortune. It was a parable of isolation, madness, and endurance. The authorities took note. The Smalls Lighthouse had revealed a flaw in the system. Never again could two men be stationed alone on a rock, cut off from rescue for weeks. Regulations were changed. Crews would henceforth be assigned in threes, so that no keeper need face death and despair without support. The policy echoed far beyond Wales. shaping lighthouse service across the coasts of Britain and Ireland. Yet the legend lived on in darker tones. Sailors swore the reef was cursed, that the ghost of the dead keeper still lingered in the spray, swaying with every storm. Some said the survivor, though freed, remained haunted, hearing whispers on windy nights, the creak of ropes where none hung. The Smalls itself was eventually rebuilt in stronger stone, but the memory of its timber tower endured, a prison in the sea where duty held a man captive alongside a corpse. Even now, the tragedy is remembered not simply as history, but as a warning. The sea demands respect, and isolation extracts a price. On the Smalls, the lantern burned bright, but it left behind a story that outshone the light itself. A tale of one man, a dead companion, and the silence that nearly consumed them both.